Whenever I give this talk, and I give a talk like this every once in a while, I see all the humanists go, oh, he's going to start talking about gig of this or peta that. I promise you, I won't say megabyte or megapixel even once through this presentation, or well, maybe once, but. Anyways, I'm with the Digital Resources and Imaging Services Unit. We're part of the library, and a big part of my job that wasn't really planned in the beginning, but emerged shortly after the department was open, was to consult with humanists who were doing digital projects. It really started out with the Digital Humanities program and those kinds of projects, and academics and researchers who were doing those kinds of projects. But it really quickly evolved into everything that was done across the humanities, some social science, and even some of the hard sciences. So what I've learned in supporting these kinds of projects is that the big questions are never asked. The questions that are asked is what kind of camera, what kind of resolution, all these gigabyte kinds of questions. But the reality is that those questions are really easy. The really important questions are the ones that I rarely ever hear people ask. And the reason being is that these questions are really, really simple, and they're really, really obvious. And as a result of that, people are almost afraid to ask them. They assume that all of their colleagues, all of the other people who are working with them on the project or funding the project have exactly the same answers that they do. But the reality is they almost never have the same answers. So what are these questions? It's exactly like they teach the students in journalism school. Who, what, when, why, and where. The really, really basic questions. Who are we digitizing the material for? What are we digitizing? When will it die? That's a really important project. We've already heard from Claudia about ghost projects, these ghost websites, where when the funding disappears. How do you manage that? How do you manage the end of life of a project? Why are we digitizing the material? Where are we going to put it? And how will we do it? These are really basic questions. They're so basic that they're just not asked. But the key is every single one of the technical answers, every single one of the organizational answers, and many of the area-specific answers, the academic answers, exist in these questions. Big projects with lots of fundings, lots of structure, lots of planning. If you ask across the project, you'll find significantly different answers to each of these questions. So what has to happen if you want to be successful, and this happens with pretty much any sort of project, an internal project, external project, collaborative project, even projects that you're paying someone else to do, the questions need to be asked formally and out loud. It needs to happen independently of any other activity. You need to sit down, have a meeting, and ask these questions. They need to be well documented, and that documentation needs to be disseminated throughout the project, even with champions and stakeholders in the project. And you have to have the answers honest. And the answers might be embarrassing. One of the really honest answers to why is a library setting up a digitization unit? Today, it's not as honest an answer, but 7-8 years ago when we set up our unit, it was quite honest. Was we don't know why we're doing it, but everyone else is doing it, so we better be doing it too. It's an embarrassing answer. It's something you'll never hear your boss say out loud. But the reality is when you have that answer and everyone understands it, it guides how you're going to ask all the rest of the questions. It guides how you're going to fund the unit, how you're going to staff the unit. All kinds of answers that are really, really important come out of these questions. So if you can get nothing else out of this talk, if you can start asking these questions, you will find a significantly different outcome to your digital humanities projects, your digital social science projects, your projects in general. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is metadata. We heard a little bit about using crowdsourcing to help mark up projects. But one of the really important things with these sorts of projects, with these interesting new digitally focused or digitally disseminated research outputs, is the fact that that you can start collaborating in new and dynamic ways, ways that you really couldn't do in the past without a really large, well-funded project. You have the ability to build dynamic relationships in between digital objects that you're capturing right within your own project. You can build relationships between the physical objects and the digital object, whether they sit in an archive, whether they're a monument that's standing on a street corner somewhere, whether they're a story from someone in a community, if you have community-driven inputs. Those links can be made, those links can be documented in a very permanent and fluid way. But one of the most important things is the ability to start building tangible relationships between your content and someone else's content. Content that could live in another digital output, in a repository, in a digital library somewhere across the world, across town. But those relationships can be built with relative ease as long as you plan properly for that kind of sharing. So metadata is something that you hear librarians talk about all the time. You might call it cataloging, you might call it documentation, notes, descriptions. It really is, it's one of those things that tends to put a lot of people off. I teach a class in digital libraries, and when I stand up to do my first metadata lecture, you just see the fear in the students' eyes. Even though they're getting cataloging in other areas, it just sounds quite intimidating. But really, it's nothing more than data about data. That's all it is. It's descriptions about other things. In the digital world, it's really how you manage everything you do. Whether it's building a web page or generating digital assets from items in your archives and repositories. One of my colleagues, Marta Bostillo, who actually is no longer with us at Trinity, she's in University College Dublin now, likes to say that metadata is a love letter to the future. And it's a really great statement to make. Because the more love you give to your digital objects, the more love you give to your research in a cataloging, in a descriptive sense, the more life it has into the future. It has the ability to be with you, to be with other people, with other researchers into the future. If you put the effort in now in the beginning, and if the effort is well thought out. You don't even have to put a lot of effort into it. You just have to be quite thoughtful about what you do. So the idea is that by cataloging your materials, you can access them in the future. They can be organized and described, and they can be discovered. And that discovery in the computer world is something that's really, really important. The most important thing today is that your metadata allows machines to understand your digital content. 90% of the work you're doing to catalog an object is going to be to support machine activities, not human activities. Everything you do online has to be managed by a machine these days. The reality is that if you're describing your metadata in ways that make it easy and standardized for machines to read and understand your content, then really exciting things can start happening with your digital objects. So overall, the really basic ideas of metadata, if you talk to a librarian, they'll tell you about all kinds of different metadata, all kinds of different exciting standards. But the reality is, as a researcher, as a humanist who's putting something together, there really are two sets of metadata that are most important to you. The first is the obvious. It's the descriptive metadata. It's the name, it's a description, a title, dates, places, those kinds of things, the things that you're probably generating already. The next type of metadata that's really important would be administrative metadata. And that's the metadata that needs to be really well thought out. And that metadata is tied to how your digital objects are managed by a machine in relationship to other digital objects and the machine environment itself. So the idea that things can be organized, things can be sorted, things can be searched, not just for this single object, but in a group of objects. To understand that you can search across all monuments in Ireland, in County Meath. Any of those things have to be described. Anything you want to do with your digital object has to be described in your metadata. any organization, any search term you want a user to use, all of those things in one way or another has to be described within your metadata. Also, the other important thing would be rights information and access limits. We're primarily talking about the humanities here today, but if anyone's working with social science data, that's really, really important. This is an area where you are protecting the anonymity of your subjects, of your research data sets, making sure that data sets that have personally identifiable information maintained behind certain barriers to ensure that you're doing your human research properly. So that's really what the core of administrative data is about. So when you look at your digital images, you go into a repository or even to a physical library, you tend to see data that looks like this. You see a creator, a title, a collection title, dates. One of the interesting things that you see in digital metadata would be things like identifiers and relations. And they may look a little bit different than you're used to seeing in your archive or in your library. This is some of the more detailed information you're very used to seeing. This is the kind of information that you'll be generating with your own digital objects. Subjects, descriptions, understanding what something is. So knowing that this is a picture of phrenology, the measuring of people's heads, which is a bit of a dead science that was never a science in the first place. So how do you do it? One of the ways that librarians use, but you don't see a lot of activity within the research community, is the idea of controlled vocabularies. And the idea of a controlled vocabulary is the ability to use a very specific dictionary to ensure that your terminology within your descriptions, within your metadata, is going to be very similar to anyone else who's doing similar work. The idea behind this is that if you want to do a search, maybe a really dynamic search using something like Google, and you want to find out about needles. Well, what kind of needles are you looking at? Are you looking at pine needles, part of a plant? Are you looking at a hypodermic needle that a doctor might give you a shot with? Are you looking at a knitting or a sewing needle? Or are you looking at a little girl teasing her older brother? I mean, how are you using the term needle? A controlled vocabulary will tell you the common way to talk about a hypodermic needle. It will tell you to use the term hypodermic needle or syringe rather than just needle. The other area that's really, really problematic with metadata that can be helpful by either metadata standards or controlled vocabulary will be with names and places. Names are particularly difficult in Ireland because of titles, in this part of the world because of titles. How do you structure a name? Do you structure it Charles R. Brown? Do you structure it Brown Charles, Doctor? How do you structure that name? Ireland is particularly difficult because of places, because place names have changed so frequently over time. I used to live in Dun Laoghaire, and Dun Laoghaire, I think, today, currently, has 3 different formal names, depending upon where you are. There's an Irish name, an English name, and a historic name. And that's common across Ireland. The county names have changed many, many times over the last 200 or 300 years. So controlled vocabularies are really helpful. The 2 most common that you'll probably run into would be the Library of Congress and the Getty controlled vocabulary for art and architecture. Those are probably the most universal controlled vocabularies that you'll run into. Some of the problems you do run into them with is that you have Americanized spellings with the Library of Congress. And some people object to the Library of Congress because it's become so large that essentially encompasses everything and defeats its own purpose. It's an enormous category. Researchers and librarians can add to these controlled vocabularies if they come into new terms. But there are vocabularies for very specific areas like Irish place names, art and architecture. If you're working in certain fields, you can find controlled vocabularies. A good way to look to controlled vocabularies and metadata standards is to look to the people you want to collaborate or the resources you want to collaborate with, digital repositories, things like European or the Irish or the Digital Repository of Ireland. Look to see what they support. Look to see what your peer researchers support, because then if you're supporting the same metadata, you can interact with them really dynamically and quickly with much less of a technical fuss than you would otherwise. And if you do things improperly, it can be really, really time consuming and expensive to correct what you've done in the past. So the most important thing with metadata is to make it functional. And as I said before, to make it functional, it needs to be machine readable. The most common form of humanities-centric metadata, it's sort of the lowest common denominator in the digital world, would be something called Dublin Core. It's a common standard, it's really simple. And if you have no ideas of anything else to use, it's a really good standard because most things support some level of Dublin Core. But to generate the machine-readable Dublin Core, you have to use a tool if you're not a cataloger and know how to write it natively. And usually the catalogers use a tool as well. So Dublin Core has something called the Dublin Core generator. You can look at how to generate a catalog record, hit a button, and it'll turn it into the computer code, the XML code that can be read by a machine. Most of the major library-centric standards have a generator you can find online. So I'd recommend you look to something like that to help you generate code that can be readable. This can be given to your technical person on your team or where you're outsourcing it, and they can implement that. Because remember, within a digital library, within a digital repository or a website, your metadata and your digital file, an audio file, an image file are separate. And they need to be linked within the code somehow so that they represent each other and they can be transported together properly if you're moving them somewhere else. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is something we've already heard a little bit about, which is intellectual property rights. Whenever an academic comes into my department, the first thing I tell my staff is don't trust them. Don't trust them for a minute. They're going to tell you that whatever they want is fine and you can put it online. But it isn't always fine. It's really important that each of you who are doing your work understands the power of what online publication is. And that power means that something that sat in a small archive being used by very few people is now available to anyone in the world. Most digital repositories have some level of international access. If it's not password protected, like Trinity's digital collections repository, it's available to anyone in the world. What that means is that when I put something up in my repository, I have become an international publisher. So anyone who didn't care that a group of people were looking at this, maybe 20 people a year, 50 people a year, 100 people a year, might care if 1 million people have the ability to view their thing. Something that relates to a family member, something that was personal to someone at some point in time, something that an estate feels they can generate money from. So you all of a sudden have become a target in one sense or another. We haven't had problems here in Ireland yet, but in other jurisdictions, particularly in America, there have been lawsuits for these kinds of publications. So you do need to make sure that you're following the law. So it's important to remember that with many digital objects, you can have layers of intellectual property rights. There is not just one right for the thing. There is oftentimes a right for the photographer who took the picture. There is a right for the intellectual output of the content that originally occurred. And with many subjects, there is more than one type of content. You may have art and writing by different authors within one page of a printed book. The publisher may hold the rights on that printed book, and the photographer may hold the rights of the photograph of that copyrighted content. So you have to be very careful about that. It's important to recognize that copyright happens automatically. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to sign up for it or fill out a form. In some places, you can register copyrights, but you don't have to. In almost every Western jurisdiction and most Asian jurisdictions as well. The way it's described in Ireland and most places is that copyright happens at the moment of fixation. Your intellectual idea is nothing more than an intellectual idea until you record it in a tangible way. Whether you put it through a microphone and record it on a tape or a CD, or into a digital file, or whether you write it on a paper or type it into a computer. That fixation, that fixity that happens is the moment that copyright occurs. In most places, copyright lasts for 70 years after the death of the author, 60 or 70 years. It's the quantity keeps going up. And if it's a corporate item, it happens for 70 years from the moment of publication. But 70 years after the death of an author is a really, really long time. What that means is that the content we're talking about around the decade of, around the Irish commemoration, the decade of commemoration, most of that stuff you would automatically think, well, it's 100 years, it's out of copyright. But actually, most of it is at risk. The reality is that because you don't know when the person died, it's very difficult to tell. The rule of thumb we use within our repository is if it's less than 125 years old, it's suspect. Because generally people don't publish until they're a bit older in their lives. But 125 years is where we feel is a good bet to actually start doing research to figure out if something is going to be difficult. So the other thing to talk about is orphan works. Orphan works are objects that are in copyright, but that they no longer have discernible parents. In the same way a child would be an orphan if they no longer had parents. An orphan is an object where you cannot determine where the copyright holder is in a meaningful way. So materials dealing with Irish independence, much of them are orphan works on purpose. The reason being is that we have a large collection of material that was gathered by an old Attorney General of Ireland before independence, and it was labeled in boxes by him as subversive, Irish subversive material. The reality is a lot of it was propaganda for independence, but it was not good propaganda to be found on your person or in your home, given what was going on at the time. So it was not attributed to an author. It was printed in the middle of night in a print shop or in someone's garage and disseminated. It was very purposefully orphaned from the moment of creation because no one wanted to be assigned responsibility to it. It might have been assigned to a party like Sinn Féin. Whether or not they actually held copyright on it would have to be determined through research. So orphan works are particularly difficult. Today, there's a few years ago, I think 2 years ago, the European Union began to register orphan work, require the registration of orphan works in an orphan works database. And the idea of that registration is, as soon as someone finds an orphan work and registers it, anyone else can use it without immediate fear of a legal liability for misusing this content. They can republish this material. It adds a level of safety. So today in Ireland, you have to go through a database that's in the Irish Patent Office and go through an application process. And that application process requires you to confirm that you have done research around the copyright status, searching for the author, and that author could not be found, and then it has to be registered. In some jurisdictions in Europe, it's still recommended. It's not required, although I believe under EU law it actually is required by everyone, but some jurisdictions really haven't put the framework in place yet. I know when we registered our first object a year and a half ago, we registered the first object in Ireland, and the patent office called us and said, we need to talk to you because we're a bit behind in putting this database together because no one had done it yet. So it still is quite new, but it's going to be more strongly enforced in the future, I'm sure. It's really burdensome. We find it takes somewhere in between 20 minutes and 3 hours per object. So if you have 200 objects in your digital gallery, you have a huge amount of work that has to take place in order to register things. So I talked before a little bit about nested copyright, and this is a great example. This is an Irish Free State official handbook from 1932. It has this beautiful artwork on the cover. It was published by the Irish government, but within this book of national information, the government asked Irish artists to put in content. We know that the book itself is likely open access because it was published by the government, but it is tied to a publisher, so maybe that publisher held rights. The artists, we don't know if they gave up copyright to their artworks to allow them to be included in the book or not. And each individual artist, and I think there's about 30 of them in the book, and they're quite famous artists whose estates would be likely to challenge publication of their in-copyright material. So this is a real problem, and it's a famous book that we get a lot of requests from researchers wanting to republish. It's particularly problematic because there's a huge amount of research that has to happen within this one simple volume that's quite popular. Other materials would be something like this that came out of the Harry Clarke Studios archive. This is a piece, this was, I believe, the first piece in Ireland that was ever published as an orphan work. And this was a letter between a client to the Harry Clarke Studios archive, to the Harry Clarke Studios business. Harry Clarke was a famous stained glass artist, and the family stained glass company, these are the archives from that business that no longer exists. So with all letters, the author of the letter holds the copyright, not the recipient of the letter. So it's quite important that a lot of archival material is letter-based, and finding the authors can be quite tricky. Even though the recipients own the copyright, own the letter, they own the physical object, the intellectual content of the letter is owned by the author. So we like to recommend that people use Creative Commons, which we've already heard about. It's a really simplified way of assigning a type of copyright to your intellectual outputs that you're generating. It allows you to limit the copyright for certain types of use, to allow people to make derivatives of your work, to change your work, to allow them to do whatever they want, to eliminate the use of commercial outputs for your work. You can kind of mix and match different features of control that you would like to have over your intellectual content that you're generating. It's well worth looking at. It can be a little complicated and confusing, but the nice thing about Creative Commons is it's very international, it's standardized. They provide the machine-readable copyright content, because even this copyright content is a form of metadata that can be just pasted into one of your metadata fields to manage the rights around your content. So I've included a number of different resources at the end that you can go to look up things, and I hope this was helpful. I know I didn't talk about any of those technical things you thought you might hear about, but the hope is that each of these three primary areas, if you can answer some of the questions in these areas, particularly that first area, it will lead you to all of those other answers. When someone asks me what kind of camera should I buy, or what is the resolution, what should the resolution of my images be, my answer is always, one of my favorite Irish answers is, how long is a piece of string? It really depends. It depends on so many different things. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and that's it.